Hello, and welcome to Reclaim Democracy, Stories from the Oslo Freedom Forum. This is a special 4-part series from the Human Rights Foundation. I'm Casey Michelle. Each year, the Human Rights Foundation brings together activists and dissidents at the Oslo Freedom Forum to call out injustice and expose threats to liberal democracy. And this series highlights some of the most compelling voices from this year's conference. Today, Part 2, Shining the Light. Our guest, Sebastien Lai, the son of free speech activist Jimmy Lai, joins us to explain why freedom of speech and freedom of press are paramount to ensuring strong democracies. But first, Sebastien shared his father's story from the Oslo Freedom Forum stage. Take a listen.
Let me tell you a story. It starts in the late 1950s. There's a boy on a train platform. He's about 9 or 10. He's hungry. You see, in Mao's communist China, food is a rare commodity. In fact, the boy doesn't remember the last time he's had a proper meal. Not since his father left, not since his mum was put in a re-educational camp. Today, like yesterday, he's carrying luggage in hopes to get some tips so he could use to buy food for his twin sister back home. Today, though, this well-dressed man, whose luggage he just helped with, gives him a half-eaten bar of chocolate. The boy had never seen chocolate before in his life. But in his hunger, he turns around and wolfs it down. Now, I don't know if you remember the first time you've had chocolate, but for a 9-year-old boy in communist China, it's magical. So he runs after the man, and he says, "Excuse me, sir, where are you from?" The man turns around, looks at him, and says, "I'm from Hong Kong." The boy thinks to himself, well, if chocolate's from Hong Kong, then Hong Kong must be paradise. One day, I will go to that paradise. Now we fast forward 30 years. The boy, and now a man, kept his promise to himself. He arrived in Hong Kong as a young stowaway, worked on the floors of a glove factory. He slept where he worked and worked where he slept. Eventually, though, he would make a name for himself. He would become a Hong Kong success story in creating Giordano, which was the fastest growing and one of the largest clothing brands in Hong Kong. A precursor to Uniqlo, if you will. The boy is now Jimmy Lai. Jimmy is keeping a close watch with what's happening across the border in China. You see, optimism was at an all-time high in the summer of '89. Pro-democracy protests asking for more civil liberties had blossomed across China. And Jimmy thought, if the freedoms of Hong Kong allowed me to go from refugee to tycoon, can you imagine what the people of China can do with those freedoms? Unfortunately, it was not to be.
Rather than be deterred, Jimmy Lai started a Hong Kong newspaper, one that openly criticized the mainland Chinese government. There were warnings against such actions. He started getting harassed and threatened with physical harm, but still, Jimmy Lai kept going. That is, until he couldn't. In 2020, China passed a new national security law that made it nearly impossible to openly voice any political dissent, and those who disobeyed faced severe consequences.
There's a knock on our family home's door. My father, at 73, is cuffed by 20 national police officers who raid our home. As they take him out, he turns around to our family and he smiles and he says, "Mzaikenga." There's no need to be afraid.
Sebastien Lai now lives in Taipei and is fighting for his father's release. He told Rob Sachs of FP Studios how he's always been proud of his father's advocacy.
Dad had a very good line, and he used to say that fear is the cheapest weapon that autocracy has to suppress his people. Because once you make them fear, they're not doing anything. They're not speaking up. They're not going to protest. They're not trying to find the truth. And growing up, I was never afraid because my father wasn't afraid. My father sort of just took it as it came, if you will. The national security law had come down in 2020. And, essentially it was a way to criminalize anything that the government didn't like, so including the pro-democracy protests. And so my father was first arrested in August of 2020. He was cuffed and then taken to his newsrooms, the Apple Daily newsrooms, where 200 police officers were there and had also recently just raided the place and paraded around. That time he was let out after a few hours in a holding cell. He was rearrested again in December and has essentially been denied bail, held in solitary confinement, and has been in prison since the end of 2020. And then in that time, they've flung a lot of these spurious charges on him, as they do, using the law as a weapon against their own people. He lit a candle and said a prayer at a Tiananmen Square vigil that commemorated the people who were massacred at the Tiananmen Square massacre, and he got more than a year for that. Another one was for attending the protests, which 2 million Hong Kongers attended. To give you some context, that's 30% of the population, and that he got close to a year as well of prison sentence. So essentially he's had all these made up charges thrown at him, and now he is currently facing his national security law charge, which is after 3 years was what he was originally arrested for, and there is a maximum sentence of life in prison. There's no jury. It's 3 government-appointed judges, a stacked deck, if you will.
So given all these instances where he's participated in activism and, was consequently then put in prison or arrested, he must have known the risk involved. Can you tell us about what the conversations were like in your family about why he continued his activism despite these risks?
We never really needed a conversation about it, because obviously what's happening now is in the news all the time, but it's worth noting that it's been going on for the last 30 years. Growing up, we always had people follow us around in a car and with cameras just to harass him. He's had, death threats. Firebombs have been lobbed at our childhood home. In Taiwan, once someone skinned a dog and pinned it on our door. It's been happening throughout my childhood and even before that, before I was born. So we never needed that conversation. We never needed to understand why Dad would stand up for democracy. I think it was a thing that we were always very proud of, and we always knew of the possibility of, assassination attempts being successful.
You talked about this going back to your father's career, how he, was a refugee coming from mainland China into Hong Kong and then built up this very successful clothing business, and then made this switch into publishing. That's a pretty big leap. What was it that made him decide, even though I'm very successful and I'm gaining means to be comfortable, I want to put myself out there and switch my trajectory to doing something that's very risky?
The turning point for him was the Tiananmen Square massacre. He realized that China was liberalizing economically, but it wasn't going to liberalize socially, and that Hong Kong needed a news media that didn't pander to the powerful, a news media that spoke truth to power, and that with the handover from British Hong Kong to Chinese Hong Kong happening in 97, that nobody was going to come up with this media. So he decided to take that upon himself and created Apple Daily, which from its get-go was not afraid to offend anyone and always had a pro-democracy stance, to its detriment, because 26 years after, the government would raid it with 500 police officers, arrest its journalists and its a few of the publishers, and force its closure. But I think I'm immensely proud of what my father has done and his journalists have done.
You mentioned also a moment where the last publication of Apple Daily, and you said 1 million people bought the issue?
Yeah. So they sold 1 million copies.
What was it like to see that solidarity from the people of Hong Kong, and also to see, how much is being done to push back against Chinese rule and to try to keep freedoms for Hong Kongers despite the encroachment of mainland China?
It's immensely inspirational. I remember the first time that, the first raid, so the first time they raided Apple Daily with 200 people in 2020. And people lined up, actually, that time as well, to buy Apple Daily the next day. And a person was interviewed in line by another publication, and he was asked, the government made it very clear that Apple Daily is now almost outlawed. Are you still willing to buy an Apple Daily? And I'll never forget this. The man turns around and looks in his camera and says, 我梗係買啦，我白紙都買, which translates to, of course I'll buy it. I'll buy it even if it was a white piece of paper. And that, I think, encapsulated the Hong Kong spirit of defiance, but also what Apple Daily meant to the people of Hong Kong.
I want to ask you about the campaign that you've been leading to get more recognition for your father's imprisonment, and what pressure points that you can find that may get Chinese authorities to listen, whether it's pressure from the outside or inside, and what you have found to be effective, or what's been, the journey you've been on to try to get, more leverage and to get the equation to change a little bit more in your father's favor.
So the Hong Kong government, to this day, still tells the rest of the world that they have the free press and the rule of law. Now, they can't assume that the rest of the world is stupid. So they can't persecute my father and all the other political prisoners without essentially destroying their own legal system. And in this, we view the point of pressure. Hong Kong is an island. It's my home. It's a beautiful island, but it doesn't have much in terms of natural resources. The reason why it became such a wealthy and great place was human capital, was people that was willing to go there, build life for themselves, risk, opening the shops, business, whatnot. And the reason why human capitals could flourish was because we had these institutions, the rule of law, the free press and whatnot. Without that, we're just an island off the coast of China. And so at some point, they'll have to make a very clear, conscious decision as to whether they want Hong Kong to flourish or to die off and be forgotten. And I obviously hope that it flourishes.
More from Sebastien Lai after the break. This is Reclaim Democracy, Stories from the Oslo Freedom Forum. I'm Casey Michelle, and we're back now with Sebastien Lai, son of Apple Daily founder Jimmy Lai.
We've seen in other places, we just saw after you, Paul Rusesabagina was on stage, and he was able to get his freedom. A lot of it came from pressure from the United States, the threat of withholding aid. Obviously, there's a very different relationship between the United States and China right now in terms of who has leverage over whom. But wondering, how much of appealing to a power like the U.S. or the EU is part of the plan, and what are some of the things that those who are watching from the global north can think about in terms of getting their governments to lend their voice to this cause and to be pressuring for more democracy and to release political prisoners?
So my father and the people of Hong Kong, what they campaigned for was to have a representative, to have someone that was accountable to this people. So if that story has touched you, write to your representative, make them put pressure on the Chinese government, on the Hong Kong government. And we've seen that to be effective. I'll give the example of Australia, who a few months ago got one of their journalists released from China, Sebastien Lai, just by putting pressure on the Chinese government. It really does work, because there is, especially in the case of Hong Kong, a need for Hong Kong to trade with the rest of the world. As I mentioned before, Hong Kong can't sustain itself. What gives me hope, though, is that the incentives are aligned to release my father, and the incentives of the Hong Kong government and the Chinese Communist Party. The reason why I say that is because it's in nobody's best interest that Hong Kong no longer has the rule of law. Now, over the last 3 years, after arresting my father, they have essentially established that he is a peaceful man who has, for the last 30 years, campaigned peacefully for democracy, that he is a man of principle, that the sole reason why he is doing what he's doing, fighting for a democratic Hong Kong, was because it was the right thing to do. And when you have a man like that at 76, and you've taken his newspaper, you've taken everything away from him, what else can you do to that man? What benefit do you get in having him die in prison? So I'm hopeful because of that.
Oslo Freedom Forum attendees shared their questions and reflections with Sebastien as well. Take a listen.
This is Nadal Al-Salman from Bahrain. I am a human rights defender who works to advocate for freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom of association, which is banned in Bahrain. What are the strategies used in Hong Kong for improving the freedom of press? Because I believe we human rights defenders, we benefit from other experiences from the other regions.
For me, one of the most poignant lesson was what Dad said. The fear is the cheapest weapon a autocracy has on you, and that you have to believe that the truth wins out, and just keep going at it without, once you decide to do it, without fearing.
This is Owen from Hong Kong, and I'm an activist currently based in UK. At this moment, there are so many social incidents and news happening right now, creating chilling effects in our society, where no one in our city know what is the red line of the government, and many people is under fear and under self-censorship. How could we, as activists, promote the courage to break through such fear and the tendency of self-censorship?
Everybody has to decide how they want to live life. It'd be unfair of me to tell them that everything is going to be okay if you speak up for democracy. Everything is going to be fine, because to your point, we live in an age now where the long arm of the Chinese state is longer than ever, where they weaponize technology, just like they have their legal system, to crack down on not just dissent within their country, but abroad. I think a person just has to decide whether they want to live free or under the palm of an authoritarian government.
My name is Mabul Mandirakiza. I'm from Burundi. My question is how you do to survive in this situation? What advice you can give us to survive in kind of this situation for people come from an authoritarian regime?
The reason why I do what I do is to see my father again. It's as simple as that. So I'll just keep doing what I need to do, and as he said, not fear. But I never thought I'd be doing this. I mean, obviously, I always. I mean, these are the values that are deeply important to me as a person. But advocating it so openly, I never would have thought that was what I'd be doing. But in doing so, I've met so many incredibly inspirational people, that really is the silver lining of going through this.
I wanted to ask you about your experience here too, working with the Human Rights Foundation, being at the Oslo Freedom Forum. You mentioned there being a community that you've found since been speaking out. What's that like to know that you are able to speak to other people who maybe have a family member in prison, who are advocating for free speech or advocating for freedom of the press, or maybe other people who are speaking out against the Chinese government or other authoritarian governments? How has that empowered you to, in a practical way, to give you more tools or to give you a network or just to give you more motivation when you're able to combine with others who find themselves in a similar situation?
Well, on a human level, it's incredibly sad that it's happening to so many people. But on a personal level, it's like a warm fire. You know that other people are going through the same stuff, and you know that you're being supported, and so it keeps me going in some sense.
Well, again, thank you again for sharing your story and for everything you're doing. It's very inspirational for everyone to hear it, and hopefully we can gain momentum to bring your father's story to light and to bring what's going on in Hong Kong to light more.
Well, thank you guys for covering it.
That was Rob Sachs of FP Studios speaking with Sebastien Lai, son of Apple Daily founder Jimmy Lai. And that's it for this week's episode, Reclaim Democracy, Stories from the Oslo Freedom Forum, a show by the Human Rights Foundation produced by FP Studios. Our team includes Rosie Julin, Rob Sachs, Omar Al-Fatihi, Tara Everton, Natalia Saucedo, Anna Peterson, and Grace Douglas. If you like our show, please rate us or tell a friend. Next week, we continue our series with a conversation with a journalist who shares his alarming findings on the state of artificial intelligence and how it's being used against activists.
If you think of democracy as being grounded in the process of human decision-making, then handing that decision-making in one way over to a machine changes the nature of the game.
We'll be back next week with more stories from the 2024 Oslo Freedom Forum. I'm Casey Michelle. See you next time.